Well, last week I finished reading, with the help of my daughter Abigail, the story Nell Garton by Jessie Chalacombe. Jessie Chalacombe was the wife of William Allen Chalacombe, the second vicar of Christchurch, New Malden, from 1893 to 1920. And it was whilst they were living in the vicarage in New Malden with their son Christopher during those 27 years that all 13 of Jessie's novels were written. The market for the novels of this type, written by Jessie Chalacombe, was chiefly created by the Sunday school movement, still massive during the Edwardian era, and in particular the prizes that Sunday schools awarded for attendance and achievement, with their stories written to encourage further active Christian faith in their readers. And Nell Garton was the eighth of Jessie Chalacombe's novels, published in 1904, and at that stage the longest book that she'd written. It's the story of the eldest daughter of a clergyman living in the north of England at a place called Norton, who decides that in response to financial problems in her family to seek employment, and ends up becoming the governess of two young children in London. The children, who belong to a wealthy upper-class family, are called Muriel and Hedsa Delamere, and are at first, and largely as a result of their parents' neglect, willful and difficult. But as the story continues, we see Nell Garton, through her steady love and wisdom, all underpinned by her Christian faith, winning over and transforming not only the children, but their largely secular parents as well. Other key characters that appear in the story include Nell's family in Norton, her father and mother, her sisters Dolly and Ethel, her brother Bertie, and the family maid called Sarah. They also include a clergyman in London called Mr. Thurston and his wife, the heir to Norton Hall, Ronald Rayland, and a doctor in London called Dr. Colville. And it's through the courage and integrity of Nell Garton that we see not only transformation come to the Delamere family, but a measure of redemption or resolution coming into the lives of all of these other people as well. But before we consider the story and its message, it's interesting, as with Jessie Chalacombe's other novels, to note the allusions to her own life within it. The most obvious of these is where Dover is chosen as the place where the Delameres and Nell go to on holiday near the end of the novel. Dover was the town in which Jessie Chalacombe was born in 1862, lived for the first 31 years of her life, and where she met William Allen Chalacombe when he became curate of Christchurch, Dover, in 1888. They were married there in 1891. A similar feature of the novel is where it reveals that Mr. Garton and Mr. Thurston studied together at Worcester College, Oxford. That was the same college at which Allen Chalacombe read theology shortly before the start of his curacy. Now, other echoes of Jessie Chalacombe's life in the novel are possible. The level of indignation shown in the book to the poverty of the Garton family shows that the plight of such clergy and their families were close to Jessie Chalacombe's heart. And although the Chalacombes appear to have been fairly comfortable in New Malden, there were perhaps aspects of the sacrifice of becoming a clergy wife after her previous life in Dover that grated with Jessie Chalacombe. Another aspect of the novel that may reflect Jessie's own life is the figure of Nell's invalid brother Bertie, and the pain this brings to Nell. Jessie Worsfold, as she was before she got married, was the third of 11 children, and mainly had sisters, but she also had a brother called, like her father and her own son Christopher, who died at the age of just 14 in 1882. Details don't survive about Christopher's condition, but it's possible that some aspects of the character and the condition of Bertie reflect this. Another interesting aspect of the story is where Jessie Chalacombe pays tribute to the other writers who influenced her. When Nell Garton arrives in London and wants Christian stories to read to the children, she wishes that she had with her some of the books of this nature that she had grown up with, and she mentions some of their authors. One of these is Hesba Stretton, the pseudonym of Sarah Smith, who wrote more than 40 Christian novels, like Jessie Chalacombe's stories, chiefly for young people, between 1866 and her death in 1911. And the other writer mentioned is A.L.O.E., the pen name of Charlotte Maria Tucker, standing for A Lady of England, who was another prolific Christian novelist who had died in 1893. By mentioning these writers, Jessie Chalacombe is almost certainly acknowledging her debt to them and their influence upon her younger life, as well as her own writings, and there's a strong degree of similarity in the quiet Christian integrity and courage that all of these writers include within their usually female characters. And of course it is Jessie Chalacombe's Christian faith that's the biggest influence upon the story of Nell Garton and the reason for its writing. Within the book, Jessie Chalacombe is encouraging her young readers to ponder the quiet courage and Christian faith of Nell in response to the problems and challenges that she faces and the way that God works through this to bring transformation. And perhaps like me, as you listen to the novel or read it, you notice the similarities to The Sound of Music, and its story of how Maria uses a similar Christian love to bring a similar redemption to the Von Trapp family. Nell Garton, of course, was written many years before the events upon which The Sound of Music was based occurred. But there's an undeniably similar theme, with a young Christian governess entering into a home where wealthy children are being neglected and transforming not only them, but the whole family through her love. And given that it was written in 1904, the insight that the story shows in terms of child psychology and behaviour is rather remarkable. It's also daring on Jessie Chalacombe's part, as she makes it obvious that the poor behaviour of Muriel and Hedsa Delamere has been chiefly caused by the neglect of their parents and their selfishness. The congregation of Christchurch New Malden during the Edwardian era would have been full of people who could have taken offence at this frankness, but Jessie Chalacombe is willing to go into quite a lot of detail on the love and attention that children need if they're to flourish, and remarkably she includes within this the need for physical hugs and affection. Now, in the context of modern safeguarding, it is a bit alarming for us to witness the constancy with which Nell kisses Muriel and Hedsa, including at their very first meeting. But in the context of Edwardian England, it's Jessie Chalacombe reflecting a strong and courageous challenge to upper-class parents to avoid the damaging emotional neglect of their children and recognise the transforming impact of love and affection upon them. And it's the love and interest which Nell shows to the children, and the creativity and imagination that she invests in her influence, that it's all overtly based upon her Christian faith. One of the key tensions within the novel is the instruction given by Mrs. Delamere that Nell is not to force her Christian faith upon Muriel and Hedsa. Mrs. Delamere is happy for Nell herself to go to church each Sunday, but she says she may only take the children if they request to go. Nell is determined to respect this, but to also influence the children through her Christian faith. And the story in many ways reflects more recent thinking about evangelism, with Nell actively seeking to kindle spiritual interest within Muriel and Hedsa through the love and attention that she shows them. From the perspective of today, however, it can seem that Nell rather oversteps the mark and the boundaries that Mrs. Delamere has established when she encourages the children to pray before they go to bed. And if they don't want to do this, she prays for them. Some might see this as showing Nell's belief that her Christian faith means that she can bend her employers' rules at this point. Now, there may be an element of this, but I believe it's chiefly based on a misunderstanding of the context. Upper-class Edwardian England had definitely witnessed a dramatic falling away in church-going compared to the Victorian era, partly through the easygoing attitude and example of Edward VII compared to Queen Victoria. But it was still a country where the overwhelming majority would have seen themselves as Christian. Muriel and Hedsa would undoubtedly have been christened, and it's enforced attendance at church that is Mrs. Delamere's main concern, rather than preventing any spirituality within the home. The other factor that it's important to bear in mind here is the potential of sudden mortality compared to today, and the influence that this had on prayers before bedtime, which were still common for many children, and would include the petition to be taken safely through the night, and if not, received into God's presence. Bearing all of this in mind, we can see why Nell, and perhaps Mrs. Delamere as well, would not have regarded the governess's prayers with the children before bedtime as infringing the instructions that she had given not to force Christian faith upon them. The turning point in the novel, and of course its most dramatic section, is where the children fall ill. Those who haven't yet heard the story and don't want the tension spoilt need to switch off now and only return once they've read or listened to it. But the sudden affliction of Hedsa and Muriel with the highly dangerous disease of measles, and how close Hedsa in particular comes to death, provides the most powerful demonstration to the Delameres of their need for God and their recognition of the power of his love within Nell. Once again, Jessie Chalacombe could be criticised for using the device of Mrs. Delamere unwittingly causing Hedzer and Muriel's illness when she insists they stay at home to play with Mrs. Trelawney's son instead of going to the children's service at church. And Jessie Chalacombe is definitely making a wider point about unintended consequences of a secular approach to life. But her major emphasis throughout this section is upon the way in which the persistence of Christians like Nell in reflecting the love of God will eventually combine with circumstances that make the reality of that love and its power able to be recognised and acknowledged. The other strength of the novel in this regard is the subtlety of the outcome of Nell's witness. Rather than having a lightning conversion, Mr. and Mrs. Delamere are left somewhere between attraction to Nell's Christian faith and bewilderment at its strange impact upon their family. In the case of Mr. Delamere, this has actually started before the children's illness, when he overhears them and Nell singing hymns, and is touched by this, kindling memories of the Christian input that he himself received as a child. Mrs. Delamere, on the other hand, is a good deal more closed off to faith than her husband. But that starts to crack, not only through witnessing Nell's devotion during the children's illness, but in the children's own response to learning that Mrs. Delamere herself had asked Mr. Thurston and the congregation of his church to pray for them while they were ill. In fact, one of the most moving aspects of the book is where Muriel and Hedzer, on reading the prayer book, express their wish to return praise to God at church and thank him for answering the congregation's prayers. And Mr. Delamere is very struck by this, saying to his wife, "Those children of ours have taught us a lesson tonight, Agatha. We ought to offer our thanksgivings too, I'm sure, if anyone ought to. What do you say to all of us going to church together on Sunday morning?" Mrs. Delamere did not look up, but she said very quietly, "I think I should like that very much, Gerard." What we see here is considerable realism on the part of Jessie Chalacombe at what happens when people start moving closer to Christian faith, including a strong measure of insight into the level of discomfort that wealthier people have to overcome in this regard. In How the Fire Spread, a novel published 2 years earlier in 1902, Jessie Chalacombe tells the story of a number of working-class families coming to Christian faith, with few of the same issues, and perhaps it reflects a certain naivety on her part. But here Jessie Chalacombe shows a great deal of insight into the upper-class struggle that she was probably more familiar with. Whilst Mrs. Delamere changes considerably after the children's illness and recovery, we're still told that Nell still saw certain traits in Mrs. Delamere's character which she did not altogether admire. And part of the book's value lies in showing that conversion is very much an ongoing process, as people's old self battles with the new one. But a further value of the book is the way in which, working behind the decisions of its human characters, it depicts God's providence. Esther is the book in the Bible where, by using the ploy of not mentioning God once, we're challenged to look for God working behind the scenes. And we see something rather similar in the story of Nell Garton. When Nell makes her courageous decision near the start of the novel to leave her home and family and enter service, it's with the aim of helping that family out of the desperate straits into which they've fallen. The immediate help that comes from Miss Lampeter in helping her secure a position shows God working through others as well. But the really startling thing in the story is how God uses Nell's courage and faith to bring about so much more than Nell herself even expects. And not just for the Delamere family down in London. At the start of the novel, the haughtiness of Nell's sister Dolly, the incapacity of her brother Bertie, and the immaturity of her other sister Ethel aren't particularly problems that Nell is setting out to resolve or expecting to be resolved. But through the courage and faith that Nell shows, these problems receive a surprising amount of resolution. In Nell's absence, Dolly, perhaps through taking on a greater amount of responsibility in the home and away from Nell's shadow, becomes a good deal more pleasant, kind and responsible. Ethel and Bertie also become closer, and Bertie's condition becomes potentially helped through the arrival into his life, through Nell, of Dr. Colville. Perhaps the most obvious signal of God's providence in the story is where Mr. Thurston, Nell's vicar in London, discovers that Nell's father was with him at Worcester College, Oxford. He remembers that Mr. Garton had previously helped him in a moment of great need and is motivated to now return this help. Like all books, Nell Garton has weaknesses, and in truth its rather rushed and cliched ending, with Nell marrying Dr. Colville and Dolly ending up with Lord Rayland, is rather contrived and too much like the ending, really, of a Jane Austen novel, particularly in the difference that the Rayland wealth will now make to the Gartons. Readers in 2020 will obviously find fault with many of the book's assumptions about gender roles, about employment, and the part where Jessie Chalacombe describes Muriel and Hedza after their time outdoors in Dover as being as brown as gypsies. It's also a little bit too defensive about the financial plight of the clergy. But given that it's 116 years old, Nell Garton stands up remarkably well. And in overall terms, the book is far from trite in its themes of Christian faith and God's providence. One of the most poignant parts of the book is where Mr. and Mrs. Thurston reflect on the past death of their own children, Olive and Anthony. And it's a reminder, like all of Jessie Chalacombe's books, of how much more of an issue sudden mortality was during that period. Something important for us to engage with more today in the light of coronavirus. Generally speaking, in Jessie Chalacombe's novels, it's the Christian characters who die when they face serious illness, while the non-Christians are spared, reflecting perhaps Jessie Chalacombe's faith in her own eternal future, tested when it came to her own premature demise at the age of 61 in 1925, and also reflecting her earnest desire for those who don't yet know Christ to come to share in this faith. So in overall terms, Nell Garton is, I believe, a bit of a classic, and perhaps the finest of all 13 of Jessie Chalacombe's novels. Yes, it's hugely idealistic, with any faults that Nell does display being completely unintended by its author. But we've got to remember that target audience of the book were very young Christians, probably in their mid to late teens, receiving such books as Sunday school prizes, and people whom Jessie Chalacombe was determined to help to try and live in the face of their problems, with an active Christian faith, hope, and love. The book, as I say, is very daring at points in its implicit criticism of the decadent aspects of Edwardian culture, and there will probably, as I say, have been some at Christ Church New Malden who resented its challenge to their priorities and their parenting. But the tone of Nell Garton as a book is a deeply humble one. And most of what we know about Jessie Chalacombe herself shows that she sought to practice what she preached in the figure of Nell Garton and her other characters. And in the light of this, it's difficult not to be inspired by this past member of Christ Church New Malden, helping us at the church 116 years later, 116 years after the publication of Nell Garton, and 95 years after Jessie Chalacombe's death, to ponder more of what it means in very practical terms to put our faith and our trust in Jesus Christ and seek to reflect his love to the world and its people. Well, to round things off at the end of reading the book, I've got Abigail Kurt with me, and she played the part of Nell in the reading of the book. I persuaded her to do that, and I'm very grateful to Abby for reading Nell. A challenging thing to do, I suppose, playing someone roughly of your age, but of a very different era, although you've got one thing in common, haven't you?
Yep, I am also a vicar's daughter, obviously, but yeah, I think...
Not so poverty-stricken, though, are you?
No, definitely not. I think she's very different circumstances to me, but I can definitely relate to the idea that she wants to be able to contribute to her family, and obviously her relationship with her siblings also, making sure that they're okay. And
yeah, what about the approach that she takes to Hedza and Muriel? So she arrives down in London with these children she's never met. The approach she tries to take is one where she's very creative, isn't she? She thinks of lots of ideas of stuff to do with them. But I suppose it's probably her love that wins them over most. Would you agree with that?
yeah, I definitely think so. I think one of the best ways I think she connects with the children is that she obviously adopts this name Sissy, and for me I think that embodies exactly what they need, because I think these children have been neglected slightly. So to have almost a relational figure in their lives, a relationship of love and care from someone, like in the form of a sister, is really what they need, much more than the kind of more the title of a governess.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. What about what's your take on the way Nell witnesses to her faith? One of the things I commented on in the talk was it could be a bit of a debating point about whether she obeys Mrs. Delamere. And I suggested some of the contextual things that might make us look on it a little bit differently. But what was your view as you read it? Do you think Nell was going about things the right way, or do you think she slightly got it wrong? What was your view?
Well, I mean, when I first read it, I did think, oh, if that was today, I think people might be a bit unhappy with the way, she perhaps used religion a bit more than parents might hope. But as you said, the context was very different. And again, like I said, those children, I think, needed love more than anything else. And so to be a witness to the Christian love, she didn't force them to do anything. She simply showed it in herself. And I think they saw that, and they saw something attractive in that. But I think the way she goes about it is definitely, she has a lot of integrity, and she does things without people necessarily knowing. But then that's revealed later to the parents through the children. So I think it's quite a nice, it's a quiet faith, but it's definitely a strong faith.
And she's very courageous, isn't she? As you read through the book, you didn't know what was going to happen because I only gave you a chapter at a time. Now, were you, like a lot of our listeners, were you nervous about Hedza? Did you think Hedza was going to die?
I was really nervous because actually you took the two final pages off me, so I didn't know how the chapter ended, so I couldn't look forward.
I kept them off the desk so that Abby would read it very authentically as Nell, not knowing what actually was going to happen to Hedza. I
was worried because obviously in the book I read last, Little Christopher's Cross, his mother dies, and it was...
Yeah, these are spoilers, I'm afraid, for people listening to this talk who haven't read the book. But,
sorry.
They've got to... Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the comments I made was that generally the committed Christian characters in Jessie Chalacombe's novel, when they get ill, they die. And anyone who's still on the path is able to survive so that they can repent, as a general rule of thumb in her stories. But that's a real turning point for Mrs. Delamere, isn't it? I mean, she's harder than her husband, isn't she, towards the Christian faith? And I think it's Nell's, the consistency of Nell's love and the difference it makes, plus her role in unwittingly helping them to get measles, that plays a crucial role. Yeah. Any other aspects of the story that you want to comment on? I mean, what did you think about ending up with the doctor?
Well, I mean, I think it perhaps was a bit of a rushed ending, in my opinion.
I
think the idea that both girls ended up married at the end very nicely, and everything was all happy. I think.
Yes, Lord Raylan didn't really know what he was taking on in Dolly, really.
Yeah, no, he only met her once, but,
Well, I'm not sure whether, it was difficult to work out, really, how much time there was for Dolly and Lord Raylan to have formed a meaningful relationship.
Yeah. I mean, considering he mistook her for the Nells character.
Yeah. But in overall terms, we read a book which is 116 years old. Jessie Chalacombe herself died 95 years ago. Is there a value in reading a book from so long ago that's not a famous book? It's not a classic book, is it? It would probably have been completely forgotten if we hadn't sort of rediscovered it. And I think when we read Little Christopher's Cross, you said it was quite inspiring to read a story by a former member of the same church as you. Did you find Nell Garton more inspiring than Little Christopher's Cross, or the same, or just different?
I possibly found it a bit more inspiring simply because she now is a girl about my age, and although it was written 100 years ago, there's still quite a lot of value in it, and I think especially surrounding the idea of the way, you know, children are treated, and I definitely think that the best way for children and young people as well, the best way you can treat them is showing love. And I think she's a very admirable character. And I think especially what's quite relevant is actually, obviously mortality rates were very high during that time, but we've just experienced, you know, I mean, we're still experiencing a pandemic. And so I think to know that we can hold on to Christian love and a Christian community is really important, and that's relevant in Jessie Chalacoom's book, but also today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Abby. Thank you for the weeks in which we came down to the church office and sat behind the microphones and read it out. And every time we made a mistake, we had to go back and correct it and that sort of thing. We're grateful to Abby for playing the part of Nell. And there are more Jessie Chalacoom stories to come. And you will find out more as the weeks go on. Thank you.